You and I have talked about it at length, which is a QBR.
Yes.
What is a QBR?
QBR is a quarterly business review. It's a time set aside every quarter to meet with key stakeholders at your client, walk them through, what happened in the last quarter, and most importantly, what's the value that you generated together and what's value you can generate moving forward. And it is a decent investment of time from both the client's perspective and your perspective. I think that might also scare people away from QBRs if they have heard of them. Feels like a huge ask to ask your client to sit down and spend that time. So I would really reframe it in more of a sales context of you have a really powerful solution to someone's problem. It is a favor in some ways to sit down with a QBR for them. That's how I view it. Yes. As you know, I'm obsessed with QBRs. I view it as this is a win-win for both of us. We're going to be able to really sit down and make sure you're getting the full value of the platform, particularly if you're paying, 6 figures or whatever you're paying for an enterprise license. Yeah. It's your duty to make sure that the client is getting all the value they have out of the platform.
I just want to kick off and say I am so thrilled to have you with us today, Rose. We've literally known each other for, I was trying to count backwards, 7 plus years when you were at your previous company. And I'm so happy I get to work with you now in your role as VP of Client Solutions at Courier Health, where I'm a very proud board member.
I'm so thrilled that you're one of our board members.
I know. It's so fun. And I've just learned so much with you, honestly, since the last 7 years. Even then, we tagged you in to please talk about post-sales. And so we'll talk about a lot of that today. So I'm really happy you're back. I really feel like no one is as passionate about this topic as you. Really? I feel like you embody.
My team would agree. They might think I'm too passionate about post-sales.
You're actually made for pod life as well. So this is long overdue, and this is why I'm so pumped to have you with us today at the drafting table.
Thank you.
So let's dive in. And I kick off every pod episode with this same question, which is, what is the number one thing you think founders should know before they start a company?
Awesome. So obviously there's a lot founders should know before they start a company, but my perspective is that an area folks potentially often miss is the ability to really effectively articulate value. And you've heard me say one of my hot takes is that no one cares about your software and you could have the best platform out there solving a ton of pain points. If you can't effectively articulate exactly why and how this is going to help your customer make more money, make their life easier, it doesn't really matter. And most importantly, you need to be able to coach your clients and your customers to be able to speak effectively to the value they're getting out of your platform, which will pay dividends across future sales motions, recurring revenue. I think a big topic in the space today is churn. And if you from day one are constantly reinforcing value, you should be able to protect against some of that.
I love that. And, we've had a few guys on here talk about sales. I think the area you particularly hone on the most is actually post-sales, right? Because almost all founders we meet know okay, I got to do sales. I got to close customers. But almost what always happens is they close a customer, they hit the gong, they're super excited, they get the signature, and then they're back to square one. They're looking for their next customer. And the number one thing I say to my founders all the time is I'm please, do not forget, if you sign the customer contract, that's only halfway on the journey, not even. That's the first third of the journey. Everything that happens after that, what we call post-sales, whether you want to call it client solutions or customer success, whatever. But if we just call it post-sales broadly, right? It's actually getting your customer on board, using your product, and ideally loving your product. But all that work after the fact, takes a ton of time, a ton of work. And so one of the things, we can talk about a whole bunch of things, but I'd just be curious your perspective there. Why do you think founders forget that? Or is it just something that is not talked about enough?
I think it's probably a mix of both. I think it's also getting those first few sales is so hard and it's so exciting once you sign the deal that just mentally maybe it's easier to be okay, now we're done with this. I also think if folks haven't been a buyer of enterprise software before, they may not realize that to the buyer, that's actually just the beginning. Yes. I would consider the sales process not done until you have a really evangelical champion at every client, which is just a certain mindset perspective to have. So I would say it's probably both just not exposure to it, but also it's really hard being the founder of a company. It's really hard being one of the first 10 to 20 people. And it's just, there's an instinct to just say, oh God, we did it.
We did it. On to the next. Yeah.
Let's just move on to the next.
I also think, to your point, maybe, I think a lot of people have not been on the other side of the table and actually onboarded, software themselves as a user, et cetera. And so you're totally right. I think they've probably have not seen what a really great post-sales process looks like. I actually think more and more people know now what good sales processes look like just from exposure. But even I've learned so much from you on what does it mean to really take a customer through from contract signing to obviously adoption of the product, but then also renewal and then ideally expansion, right? And more and more and more. So one of the really specific things I actually think would be so helpful to dive on, because I just think it's so tactical. You and I have talked about it at length, which is a QBR, quarterly business review. And the reality is I actually think a lot of founders, again, if you've never been part of a QBR, you would not know what a QBR is, right? So
I think a lot of folks don't know what a QBR is.
Yeah. So maybe let's start there. What is a QBR?
Yes. Okay. QBR is a quarterly business review. It's a time set aside every quarter to meet with key stakeholders at your client, walk them through, what happened in the last quarter, and most importantly, what's the value that you generated together and what's value you can generate moving forward. And it is a decent investment of time from both the client's perspective and your perspective. I think that might also scare people away from QBRs if they have heard of them. It feels like a huge ask to ask your client to sit down and spend that time. So I would really reframe it in more of a sales context of you have a really powerful solution to someone's problem. It is a favor in some ways to sit down with a QBR for them. That's how I view it. Yes. As you know, I'm obsessed with QBRs. I view it as this is a win-win for both of us. We're going to be able to really sit down and make sure you're getting the full value of the platform, particularly if you're paying, 6 figures or whatever you're paying for an enterprise license. Yeah. It's your duty to make sure that the client is getting all the value they have out of the platform.
Absolutely.
I really feel that to my core, that if you're not ensuring they're getting all the value, you're being negligent in terms of someone that you sold a promise to.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to your point about 6-7 figure deals, because I do think that is oftentimes something founders are thinking a lot about. Okay, well, I'm not selling a 6 to 7 figure deal yet. Maybe it's a 50K ARR deal, a 75K ARR deal. What do you think is a sweet spot by which a QBR, given the time investment you're putting in, is really worth it? And do you see scaled back versions of QBRs if you are selling a lower ACV product?
So I think a full-scale QBR is probably around 200, 250. But I want to call out that depending on the product you have, and hopefully you're developing a lot of great features and new modules to sell clients, a $50,000 license could turn it into $1 million ACV at some point. Yeah. So that's super important to keep in mind. If you're at that 200, 250 level, I think that's where I think it's really a responsibility of the vendor to ensure that you're having a QBR and ensuring folks get value. You can do a scaled back version. So I know we plan to go into really specific tactics I recommend to share during a QBR. A lot of these things can be somewhat automated, and maybe it's actually a monthly or quarterly email that's going out that you figure out a way, especially with the AI tools today, to ensure that you're at least putting an explanation of your value in someone's hands, even if it's not a full day on site in person.
And even if it's not in person.
Yeah.
Okay. That's really helpful to hear. Okay. So what do you think is the number one goal of a QBR? You talked about it a little bit already, but I love this one way you framed it, which is if your champion saw the CFO in an elevator tomorrow and they asked if your platform can be cut from the budget, what would they say?
Yes, that's always my number one goal, is that everyone walking out of the meeting is super enthusiastic about the value your platform is creating, and they have a really nice soundbite. And I think a lot of folks, might have a really excited user champion, might have someone at the director level who really understands why they bought your product, might have someone at the C-suite level who can articulate, hey, this fits into our AI strategy or this or that. But most people can't on the spot come up with that succinct rationale for here's exactly why this is a must-have at our company. And even in a calm economic period, maybe right now we're not sure what we're going through, but it's even more important then to make sure everyone is armed with that quick one-liner, two-liner, this is why we need this product.
Yeah. Yeah. And I say this all the time is, as much as your champion, might love your product and, again, be championing you, they also have a bajillion other things going on every day.
Yes.
So they might not be thinking constantly about like your company and your ROI. And so it is really on you to educate and to train, I say train the trainer or something, or whatever the phrase is, right? But enabling your internal advocate as much as possible so that they can go and advocate for you even better, right?
And keeping in mind that can be a real win-win. I know something we've talked about a lot is if your platform can help someone get promoted, what an incredible experience that A, they're getting value to your platform, B, you're helping develop their career, and C, now you're really creating a lifelong champion that as they move to different organizations, they're emotionally tied to your success because they know that you're tied to their success.
Totally.
So that's another opportunity that maybe helps reframe for some folks who might feel uncomfortable pushing and articulating their value. It's like, hey, you're also doing this to show off the excellent work that the folks using your platform are doing.
Totally. And I think some of it, again, is like, we focus so much on sales training for our own internal, like, AEs and reps on our own team. But I sometimes say, like, you have to also think about sales training like your customer, right? And that they are able to, again, to your point, have the sound bites ready on hand, just as you would expect your own team to have that enablement as well.
Yes. And I think you have a whole separate podcast on where should post-sales sit in an organization. That's a whole conversation. But even if it's not in the sales org, which we are not in the sales org, I do think, sales training on some cadence for a post-sale team is super important. I think a lot of people miss that.
Yeah.
And you can push the team to be as efficient as possible. As Michaela said on your podcast, you really be super cognizant of what your service is versus platform revenue is. You can do it in a way that also allows them to be really sales-minded. And I actually think if they're sales-minded, they can be more efficient in a lot of ways because they can understand, hey, here's the highest leverage use of my time.
Yeah. And going back to, again, the QBR, like, of course, it's a way to talk about your value. But again, I think it really enables the customer to, again, be able to like tell your story and champion it even more, right? And so should we talk about who to include in the QBRs?
Totally. So I'd say you have a wish list of who you want to include in your QBR and then probably more of a realistic list of who comes. I would always ask if the check signer is there. And maybe even depending on price point and who signed the check, if their boss could be there as well. You have to make the ask because they're not going to come without the ask. So just go ahead and make it. The worst they can say is no. And then when they say no, you have an opportunity to then follow up. After the meeting, have someone senior on your side send over a follow-up and say, hey, sorry we missed you. Thought you might be interested in these 3 core slides. That's something that we do all of the time is if the senior person we're targeting wasn't able to make it, always do that quick follow-up. And then at least you're in their mind space as they're going through things. I think the main user can be really helpful, the internal champion, anyone from an ops or IT perspective that's helping to support the platform, probably a core representative from the key stakeholder groups. So you want those folks there. We often will do somewhat of like a user spotlight. I do think you want to be careful about when that happens and how long folks are in the room for and just making sure that everyone's there for the most appropriate use of their time. But just to recap, I'd have a key representative from each of the core stakeholder groups that you work with. And then I know we've talked about, I also recommend having a detractor in the room if anyone's there. That is a hot take. But wouldn't we rather know what they're saying up front versus finding it out later on? And when we talk about a prep for a QBR, the optimal state is that your clients are either co-presenting with you or really owning a lot of this. And we've seen some really powerful conversations happen internally at our clients at our QBRs. We were just talking about this in one of my team meetings that more and more as we elevate our client stakeholders, they're taking on some of these conversations and really important internal dynamics are kind of hashed out at our QBRs, and we're more serving as a force and function to allow that to happen. So that is one of my hot takes. Your mileage may vary. Make sure that it's the right. Make sure that it's not too big of a risk. But I think having someone that you've been working to convert into a passionate champion in the room, it's going to mean so much more to them to see their colleagues talking about the value this has added. And we have successfully converted folks who are detractors or not really sure into some of our biggest advocates by having them in those conversations. and seeing it come to life. And then I think also maybe people want to be a part of that success sometimes.
Totally. I imagine, especially in a large enterprise, right, where there are so many different teams oftentimes, and they might be working closely together, it might not, right? And having this opportunity, again, once a quarter to actually come down and have these conversations that might only be happening like in passing or, so almost, again, creating that space and that time is the point of it too, right?
Yes.
And that they might not otherwise have the mental space to sit down and like have these conversations.
Yeah, and in a post-COVID, some companies are primarily a remote era. We found it's really impactful, again, for the license fee that makes it worth it to have these folks come together. For some of our clients, these are some of the only times they come together.
That's right. That's right.
And we see a ton of other positive outcomes from that, whether it's just team bonding or it's even they get to talk about strategic projects they don't get a chance to talk about offline. And it's such a huge benefit for us to be able to end those conversations, even in the hallways. You can't replicate some of that on a Zoom meeting. You really can't.
Totally.
I can't tell you the amount of times like we both went to the bathroom at the same time. Right, when we're walking there, what do you think John meant by that comment? Or super curious, like Sarah was so interested in this, and then you get a ton of intel you never would have gotten.
And those
prior.
The dynamics there and seeing that in person that you can't see on Zoom. What are your thoughts if, again, this we're seeing this with so many of our companies where their customers really are not in the office anymore, or if they are, they're in they're in Dallas and SF and Chicago, and so some of these people, I imagine, of course, their customers are still probably meeting once a quarter somewhere, maybe for an offsite.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to
really
get
hard.
people together. Do you think the QBRs still have value if it's not in person?
I think they still have value in that you need to be having these conversations. I do think they're much more valuable in person. We recently made a team rule that for the next 2 quarters, we're going to test and learn if folks won't do a QBR in person for whatever reason, that we're going to kind of enforce we do it in person or not. So we'll see how that experiment goes, but it's just so much more powerful. I think that it's a lot more powerful in person, but we've had QBRs remotely, and at least you're still getting those conversations going.
Okay, cool.
And if you don't mind, I wanted to go back to your question on how this relates to the sales process.
Yeah.
And I am very sorry to break it to everyone, but you are constantly in a sales process.
That's right.
I learned early on in my career in software that an MSA and an SOW are pieces of paper. And are you actually going to take, and I won't say which company, but in my experience, Burger King to court? No, you're not.
Yeah.
They are going to bleed you dry, especially if you're a Series A seed stage company. Yeah. It's a nice thing for us all to feel like we have a contract. But at the end of the day, an entire C-suite could be replaced with a new CEO comes in. Macroeconomic climate can change. They start cutting budgets. Something totally like one of these black swan events can happen, like COVID or something. And hey, we're just going to stop paying our vendors. I saw David Pleatitas, who I absolutely love, who I met through you, talking about, put all your vendors on the line. Like, don't follow the rules of the contract in this sort of environment. Protect yourself. That's how large enterprises, especially public companies, are going to operate as well. And yeah, again, hate to break it to people, you're always in a sales process.
That's right.
Especially with a large ACV situation. So I view these QBRs, we actually view them as sales activity. That's often how we're categorizing it as well, is even if we're not upselling something, which you should always have something to upsell.
Always be upselling.
Always be upselling. This is the warmest lead you're ever going to have.
That's right.
Why would you not take advantage of that? But even if you're not upselling, you really always are.
Yeah.
That's how I tell my team. You're always in a sales motion.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, again, as you think about like the whole sales life cycle, that's why I do think it's very misleading. Like the gong is like the end when really it is just the beginning and you're the first.
Yeah, I do think I see sentiment changing on this a bit, is that I see more of a recognition that like handoffs between teams are really jarring, a recognition that customers really do not like the feeling of, I had such a great experience talking to Jess and she built me this whole vision of how I was going to use the system. And then I got passed on to Rose and, she was just like, okay, fill out the onboarding doc. And it was like a totally different vibe.
Yeah.
That's really jarring for people. I think there's a lot more of a recognition of that, but as you said, I do feel passionate that post-sale still doesn't get the credit they deserve.
Totally.
It is a revenue. I have a very hot take that I think post-sale is a revenue generating group. I don't agree that it's a cost center. It's a whole other conversation. But again, you're always selling and you're protecting recurring revenue at your company, which is the biggest asset of your company.
Yeah,
especially as you look to get acquired or IPO, that's what you're being valued at.
Absolutely.
So you wouldn't just leave all of your money like in a pile on the floor in New York City. Like you would have people actively devoted to protecting that.
Totally.
And that's what a post-sale team, in my perspective, really should be, is constantly understanding how can we engineer more value for our clients and then ensure that they are reciprocating us for that value.
Yeah, I mean, we can figure out if this belongs in this episode or a whole nother episode, and you'll come back for it. But, the debate of whether a post-sales team should like have a sales mindset. I mean, I feel very strongly. I think you feel very strongly that, like, absolutely, right? Like, a post-sales team should also still think like sales team members.
Yeah. Well, this actually I do think relates back to QBRs, and I've had some really interesting internal conversations recently as folks are advancing in their career and coming to me with really fantastic questions or advice on, hey, as I'm moving into this more senior role, I maybe feel uncomfortable feeling like I'm a salesperson, or I don't think it's in these QBRs, I don't necessarily know if it's our place to give so much strategic advice. I kind of, maybe we just deliver our software and move on. And I've had some really great conversations on, if you're buying an enterprise SaaS platform, you are buying the platform, but you're also buying an expectation that you're working with people who can help you advance your business. At the end of the day, that's the goal, is advance our business via XYZ mechanism. And that's where it truly is a partnership. And for folks that maybe are uncomfortable with post-sales, feeling like a sales motion, I do think you can reframe to, you are a true thought partner of your client and you are responsible for helping them getting value. I've seen that mind shift, that different framework shift some minds on my team of, okay, I'm not here like shilling something.
Yeah. Oh, it's a consultative.
Yes, I'm being consultative.
Yes.
I want to help my company, help folks in our client get promoted, help them run their business better. My current role, I'm super lucky to be at a very mission-driven company that we're all really passionate about, and you can see very clear impacts from
of how
what
the product
we do
is doing that,
and how the product's doing that.
Yes.
But I also reframe to that, hey, if you truly believe in what our product does, and I think you should only work somewhere that you're super passionate about, wouldn't you want to help people do more of that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think reframing it in that way is, so many people think sales is like a dirty word.
I know.
I think I really used to as well before I moved into more of a sales role. And then I realized, oh no, you have a problem. We have a solution. Let's come together.
Yeah.
We each have a role to play here. I'm not forcing you, I'm not selling you a widget. Like, I'm selling you something that I think is really going to improve your life.
Yeah, totally.
So if you can reframe to that, that's what a QBR is about. How can we help you solve your business problems?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it needs it needs a little bit of a rebrand, to your point, right? And that way people feel so much better about it. Awesome. I mean, and the one other user group perhaps to include that I know you feel that you've mentioned in QBRs also is potential new business. Right.
Yes. Thank you. That is something that I think can be really powerful, of if you have an adjacent function that you have a solution for, inviting them to come for the roadmap piece of the presentation, or even, again, asking your champions, who else do you think can benefit from this? I think QBRs are also helpful for internal development, of realizing it's okay to ask people for favors. We're doing a lot for them.
Yeah.
Also, the more you ask people to support your organization and the more they do, the more psychologically tied they are to it as well. So saying, hey, Jess, we do so much for your accounting team, and we could actually really help the accounts payable people too.
Right.
Do you have any friends there? Like, what do you think they're struggling with? That's not you selling something. That's, oh, I do have a friend in accounts payable and she really hates how XYZ works. Why don't we make her life better together? So exactly. I think inviting folks from adjacent or related functions in the company that you could also help, nice for them to see the work that you're doing for their peers.
Awesome. Okay. And then let's get into the actual QBR, which is like, what are things you actually talk about, right? For these are long sessions, or they can be, right? A few hours.
I think it can vary, again, probably depending on price point, depending on if you're offering more of a point solution or an operational system. I think for more of a point solution, you can probably do 60 minutes. If you're offering a full operational system, a full platform, for example, the users of my current software, this is their full operational system. So we'll do more of a full day to go through everything. So modulate that as appropriate for your business. But I would say that, of course, the first thing is a strong executive summary. I'm also weirdly passionate about executive summaries.
I want to hear it.
Can anyone who this piece of paper was printed out and they saw it on a table at the office, can anyone without context immediately understand the value we're providing? It needs to be simple, very hard. It's much harder to have a simple message than a more complex message. It needs to be easily understood. This is back to the original question of the number one skill for a founder. I've had so many of my friends, you've only ever worked in startups. What about XYZ? And we're having a conversation for 5 minutes. And I'm I still don't really understand what the point of this is. It should be immediately accessible. You don't need to have any other context. And then I do think it should also be direct, which is another skill, a writing skill that isn't really taught in school because it doesn't make as much sense, but it needs to be really direct writing and prescriptive of how you should think about the next step. So a very strong executive summary. Today in my role, all I really do for QBRs is work on the exec summary. So I'm not a part of the rest of the process, but I'll read through the deck the team's put together. And my contribution is let's make sure this exec summary reflects all the awesome work you guys are doing in a very simple, easy to digest way.
And is it just a summary of the last quarter, or is it hey, this is a big vision and a recap of everything that what we're bringing to the table?
I typically do it more the last quarter, but again, in a way that you don't need some sort of crazy context to understand. Sure. So the exec summary, do not skimp on the exec summary. You may only get to 10 slides if you're having a really engaging session, which is awesome. That's great. If folks are really engaged, make sure each of your core points is laid out in that original slide. I would cover, what did you guys accomplish together? Again, a really great opportunity to highlight champions from your client team. Rebecca worked super hard on this. It was amazing. Here are some of the outputs. I would cover specific value you feel that you've generated. This is where it's really important to be in lockstep with your client. So lots of different types of analytics that are going to vary a ton on different business models, but ensure that someone in the room is going to stand up and say, exactly, we couldn't have achieved this project without them. We wouldn't have saved this money without them, or we wouldn't have gained this new revenue without them. So just drive to it. And if you can't articulate that, I think that's a problem with the business model.
Yeah.
That's much bigger than a QBR.
Yeah. And we should go, I don't want to jump around too much, but we should go to the prep of it, right? And how you get those numbers. Because sometimes those numbers are not easily understood.
So let's say you have those numbers, which is
let's say you have those numbers.
Big assumption. Yeah. Put them out there.
Yeah.
And then the two other core points I would say is aligning strategically with your client and then sharing the roadmap. So aligning strategically with your client is a great opportunity to say, hey, can you guys tell us what's coming up and what's important for you in the next few months? You obviously have a CDA or an NDA as a vendor of the company. They should be willing to tell you a little bit more than publicly available information. How can we help? And then obviously it's best to get this information on the side first so you can have ideas to offer in that. But even if you can't, hearing it straight from the horse's mouth is super helpful. And then finally, a roadmap section. And again, this requires a lot of partnership with your product team, ensuring there is always an exciting and well mapped out product roadmap. This is where you start to plant those ideas of here's what we could do together in the future.
Yeah.
So again, strong exec summary. Here's what we actually accomplished together. Here's what this means from some sort of hard business numbers perspective. What do you guys need our help with in the future? And then what is our roadmap? I think those 5 core sections are critically important, and they may vary based on the material within will vary based on the business model of your company as well as your clients. But if you're not hitting all 5 of those, I would ask yourself, why is that?
Yeah. And here's one more I'm curious your take, but also adding in what's not going well. Is that a good thing or a bad thing to include?
That I do remember I had this as a hot take at a recent work batch event. I would include it. I would include it. We've actually seen a ton of value out of upfront stating what is or isn't going well.
Yeah.
This is where you want to be super surgical on who's attending when.
Yeah.
I say a lot. This is this is a Broadway play. This is not a UFC match. We're not like waiting to see who wins.
I love it. I know. That's my favorite line of this entire episode. I already know it. I already know this is my favorite line, right?
We need to know exactly what's going to happen. Everyone already knows their lines. And maybe we don't know where the audience is going to cheer, gasp, but like we should know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
If you're like, let's see how they react.
Yeah.
I don't recommend that.
Right.
But to that point, what you could have is discussions on like, hey, look, I just want to face head on.
Right.
We faced maybe last quarter, your product had some downtime. Similar
Which
to,
also I just want to call out, like there's no
okay.
100% product,
Yes.
right? Like I know, I think that is in a lot of ways the post-sales role is responsible sometimes for product gaps or deficiencies. And I actually just want to call out that is perfectly normal. I mean, obviously later stage companies, that happens all the time. So, especially obviously early stage, right? And I think that is where like a lot of the pressure is like, should we call out the fact that like we had XYZ kind of gaps?
Well, and to the point of the Broadway play, I would, if you know that the buyer, the C-suite sponsor of this is going to be in a certain section, maybe let's have a very specifically choreographed section for her.
Right.
That is going to be really positively showcasing yourself and the rest of your client partners. But for more of the working group, I think that builds a ton of credibility. And I think Natalie from your product marketing interview talked about people like to be a part of a story. Yeah. I fully believe that. People love to be a part of your journey. People who buy an early stage platform, they're doing it because they like to be innovative. They're on the beginning of that curve of the hype cycle of adoption. They want to be a part of it. And I think it's counterintuitive, but sometimes them going through a tough situation with you and everyone coming out, happy and okay on the other side builds more loyalty than just everything going fine.
Totally.
I really do think it because they feel in the trenches with you. So
which is scary and like counterintuitive, but like the vulnerability in some ways builds the trust and credibility.
You have to be vulnerable. You can, again, script this up front, but sometimes that's the role I would play in a QBR is stepping in at a certain section and be like, hey, I want to own that we had XYZ bugs this quarter. And that's not what I want. It's not what you guys want. And we really appreciate your partnership. And here's our path moving forward.
Yeah.
I've built probably my strongest executive relationships on, hey, we acknowledge what went wrong.
Totally.
And we are 100% here to help. I also think you want to give their team the opportunity to give you some ideas.
Yeah.
Probably not like product ideas.
Yeah.
That's for a different section, right? That's for like product feedback interviews and everything. In this QBR, it could be more like, hey, our ways of working, maybe we have this meeting every other week instead of every week, so you guys have more time to give us updates. Or maybe we actually want to use a form to submit feedback so we have a log of it. Yeah. Or we love how I got this feedback in the, at this point in my career, I'm at a QBR probably every week. So I see a ton of, or multiple a week, I see a ton of different feedback. Some interesting ones from the last few weeks were, you guys are so on top of things. You're always emailing us about stuff. It's actually too much. Like, we can't work at this pace. We would like you to like bundle everything into like a weekly digest.
Totally.
Great. That's really good feedback. I am normally coaching the team, you're responding to emails within X hours. Yeah. Something comes up, you're on it immediately. Super helpful to hear from that client. Like, you know what? This is a client with a huge book of business with us. You are working with so much of our company. Like, let's just dial this back to most important once a week.
Yeah.
Love that suggestion. And now they feel super bought in. I'm like, we're the ones who changed that process.
Yes.
We had a client last week also say, you're releasing too many features, which I absolutely loved.
That's an incredible thing to hear.
And we brought some of our product team to this meeting. Again, we push hard for live. And it was really great to hear that they were like, keep doing what you're doing, but we need more of a mechanism to like bundle these. We only want to hear about them once a month. Hearing everything you guys have going on, it's like actually a bit overwhelming. We don't know what we want to incorporate.
Yeah.
But that was really powerful feedback.
Super.
Validating to our product team that they're so effective at pushing out new features. And now, we've set that baseline. And if later on they're like, oh, why didn't you tell us about that? Like, we have a exact reason why.
Yeah.
So I think them feeling a lot of ownership in how you're working with them builds much closer relationships and more credibility.
I love that. Okay. So getting to the prep of it, right? Because like obviously a Broadway show requires rehearsals, right? And, perhaps one of the things that like we talk about the most with some of our founders is ROI,
Yes.
right? Like, and this goes for all enterprise SaaS companies, right? Throughout the whole organization, not just in post-sales, but like being very clear about the ROI and value that we're actually creating for our companies, for our customers. And sometimes, in an ideal world, your product has this dashboard and it tells you and measures all the ROI, and there's a benchmark and there's an A/B, and you can see very clearly like the attribution of like, we start working with you here and look, your revenue numbers went up and to the right.
Dream.
But before it wasn't like that. So, but like to your point, like I don't think that's always how it plays out, especially for earlier stage companies where maybe getting those baseline benchmark numbers are not always so clear. You do your best, but it might not be built in the product. So like there is a little bit of partnership that is needed to like actually have the customer, perhaps share some of that information with you. Do you have best tips on
Well, I really think this needs to start in the sales process, which is also why regardless of where post-sales sit, you need to be working really closely with sales.
Yeah.
Folks probably using some type of framework in enterprise sales. My favorite is Medic, but whatever you're using will have something around what's the business metric that you're going to drive.
Yeah.
This conversation needs to happen in the sales process. If you're not having that conversation in the sales process, I think it's a big miss because you're probably you could sell at a higher price if you sell on value, but then B, you're not well set up to say, what does success look like for you guys once you're using this system? And it's going to be more based on their vibes or their feelings if you want to keep using this. So my first piece of advice is it has to start in the sales process.
And is it one business metric? Is it multiple?
Getting very tactical, I think you need at least one that's measurable, and then maybe some insurance for yourself is to have others. So, hey, we really want to drive, more new business. No, regardless of what environment you're in, that should be somewhat relevant. Let's say it's more new business or more cost savings. So whichever that core metric is, I would break it into 3 or 4 component metrics that you can also suggest to the customer. It's always better to be a little prescriptive. Hey, especially in an enterprise environment, folks are looking for thought partners. So to be able to say, hey, I know we're selling you this platform, it's going to save you costs. Here are the 3 main buckets we see it. We're going to be able to report on at least one of those. And then once you've aligned on those, that sets you up really well for the QBR to be able to say, hey, we said we were going to do this. We actually did it. And I hope that also informs how folks are building the product, how they're thinking about it in that early seed stage, well before we had any customers. It was, what is the value this is going to provide? And as we build the platform, make sure that's somewhat clear. As you said, it's still often kind of hard to pull these numbers, but it's really worth the time investment. And the earlier you start, the better off you are. If you don't start doing this until you have 100 enterprise customers and you're working with, 20% of the Fortune 500, and all of a sudden you need to start pulling these numbers because their CFO demands them and no one's pulled them from your platform, that's going to be a scary situation. But if from day one you've been pulling something, when new features and functionalities are built, that's part of our product roadmap process is like, what data can we get out of this? How can we enable the team?
Yeah. And how much of that is, again, data that you can pull yourself just from perhaps your own product and usage versus having to go to the customer and say, hey, can we review what we did with you last quarter and perhaps how many hours maybe your team put in and how many hours your team was all like using the product or not using the product, et cetera, et cetera.
I do think you have to do both. It's not an either or.
Yeah.
One, I would just love to hear their perspective. And 2, you do need to validate numbers to the point of the scripting. If you show up and the first reaction is, this does not resonate at all. Like, what are you guys talking about? If you're like, we saved you $10 million in your project planning process. And they're like, we were actually over budget by 20% this year on our projects. Like, what are you guys talking about?
Yeah.
Maybe you are right. Maybe they would have been 30% over budget without your platform, but you need to have drilled into that beforehand.
Got it.
So you need to ask them regardless. Maybe they come up with a metric you hadn't thought of. That actually, one of our strongest metrics that we now use with folks, which is pretty industry specific, so not worth getting into, but a client was the one who was like, hey, this is really where we're seeing value.
I mean, that's great. So incredible, right?
Run with it everywhere.
How powerful that is.
Yeah. So your clients know their business best.
Yes.
They know, in some ways, they know your platform best.
Yeah.
Like you guys, I'm not using our software all day long. So I ask them no matter what.
Yeah.
But then I would be having, obviously pull data on your own side. I would plug a few am I allowed to plug vendors here?
Go for it.
I think things like Appendo or an Amplitude, like whoever you're using to like see usage on your platform.
Yeah.
I would invest in those.
Yeah.
Those are also often all product-led growth products. You can get a free trial on most of these things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or even Google Analytics. Like have something to understand what your usage is.
Yeah.
So you can, at the bare minimum, be like, hey, we have 10 logins a day into our application. I think that's the bare minimum.
Yeah.
And then in terms of very tactical and how to prepare, I do think something interesting to consider upfront is how quickly you want to get specialized. So probably at the beginning when there's only 10 of you in a room, maybe actually your lead engineer is pulling some of this for you. As you expand, maybe you have more of an internal data science team. Maybe you have one person who helps post-sale. Maybe eventually then you have someone dedicated in post-sale to value engineering. Another title I'm seeing floating around a bit is, hey, all I do is think about how we're adding value to our clients. I create a lot of templates, and then I work with the specific client team before they prep for each QBR. One thing is that the quarters come faster and faster every year. So you're finished with one.
Very fast.
And you're on to the next.
Yeah.
So having as much as this as you can get templatized, the better. So think that way from the beginning, but the folks helping make that happen will probably evolve over time.
Yeah. And again, tactically speaking, right, one of the things, again, in the line of Broadway show is you would not want to show up to your client with the QBR slides and have any of it really be a surprise to them.
Oh, yeah,
right?
that's a big
and
problem.
So having even a dry run maybe with your champion, it sounds like, to say, hey, look, like these are the things we're planning on presenting to you and your team. Could you review it, make sure we're aligned and it looks good and there's no kind of surprise on your end?
Yeah, tactically, that's a requirement on our side. Is if you think about the prep, just to get really specific, it's helpful for folks. We start about 6 weeks out of what's our story going to be for this QBR. So start with that executive summary in mind. Start pulling some data to see if you can confirm that story. Probably about 4 weeks out, you run that story by the champions at a high level. About 3 weeks out, you're going to do internal dry runs. Let's make sure that, someone like myself or whoever else signs off on this pressure tests some of the hypotheses that we're going to share. And then 2 weeks out, you want to do a dry run with someone. And then we really try to hold ourselves to 1 week out, send over the materials. So folks can digest it. To everyone.
And even if they might be in person or not,
yes,
they see it.
They see it. And then the discussion can be even more impactful when you move from presenting the material to discussing it. In my experience, that's an evolution per client. The first few times you do this, it's going to be like, interesting, like what's happening here? Like they're more digesting. And then as they're more familiar with your product and your process, it really can move to a well-executed working session. Again, no one should be surprised by anything, but you can move from, we had 15 users in the platform and they did these 10 activities to, what do you guys think would drive higher adoption of this feature that we know adds business value? And that is where you start getting like real nuggets that you can share across your whole company.
That is the magic. Yeah. Awesome. And then a few other things I know, tactically speaking, right? Doing a spotlight, right? And like, I love that you had said this before. It's like you're doing this in a way to like celebrate them too and like the work they do. And I think it's such a reminder, like obviously we want to get to like numbers and like value, but part of it is just like showing like the human side of it, right? Whether it's your customers or even just like who they are and what they've done. I know you guys have been like really thoughtful in like putting the human piece to it.
Yes, I love a spotlight, whether it's an anecdote or an individual person. That's where, again, maybe you have this person come to the meeting depending on what the travel situation is, and you highlight them in front of like a C-suite member at their company, like, and they get to present what they did. I think it's actually quite similar to internally. We talk about the importance of culturally having value awards or giving kudos, building a really supportive internal culture where folks feel rewarded for their hard work. You can do that at your customer as well. And I think a lot of the most successful SaaS companies of all time do that. Adobe, Salesforce, Viva. People have that on their LinkedIn that they got this award.
Totally.
Right? Like that just starts to be a huge moving snowball accumulating over time of when folks are proud of what they did in your system, they're going to not only be advocates for you, but maybe in a public forum.
Yeah.
Like I love I think one of the most exciting moments at a startup is when you start seeing on people's resume, like skill in XYZ tool.
Yeah.
Like, that's so exciting. And why don't you give them, why don't you put that in their head to put it on that you got a XYZ award?
Yeah.
And that's I think just a feel good moment for everybody.
I know. And these small things, which might not feel, that big to us, but it can make a really big difference, right?
That's also free.
Yeah.
And it is kind of one of the easiest things to prep, I will say. Like, don't overthink it. We don't need to have a model every quarter of who's spending the most time in our system or who got the most ROI.
Yeah.
I would highly recommend against that. I would actually recommend giving yourself some flexibility, and every quarter you're picking someone for a specific reason.
Yeah.
So low prep and really high value add.
I love that.
At $0 cost.
And then we touched on this a little bit, so we can splice this part back to the earlier part. But you had framed this in a way too, in terms of like the point around, should you acknowledge if something like is not going perfectly, right? Is to frame it, here are 3 things we think could be going better, right? Like, do you agree that these are like the same things, right? And sometimes also framing it like that, getting their reaction to be like, this is what we think is like needs the most work. Do you agree or not?
Yeah, I definitely think that can be a helpful mechanism. I also think, again, hot take, mileage may vary. I think sometimes you can say, hey, here's what we need from you guys.
Yeah.
Like, this is where we don't feel like we're getting our end of the partnership, which can help maybe balance out power dynamics. And I've actually only ever seen people respond really positively to that, which is kind of, again, counterintuitive or surprising. But we've had some really powerful conversations with clients where they're like, you know what, you are absolutely right. Like, part of the reason we haven't achieved this ROI goal we set out is because we never gave you these inputs, or because we never aligned as a company on what we were doing on this strategy.
Or there's some other internal stuff that we are not aware of.
Yes, and
right?
now I'm letting you know that, or we didn't actually decide, was Jess or Rose responsible for driving this project forward?
Right.
And I've actually seen powerful moments on this on Zoom, and I've been talking about a lot in person, but even on Zoom, like, it's really powerful for folks to say, hey, yeah, we actually are not holding up our end of the bargain here either.
Wow.
And it's so much better to have that moment than to just, everyone in enterprise SaaS has had that, those clients that are maybe a little bit tough to deal with.
Yeah.
Well, call it out. If you can find a way to do that appropriately, respectfully, that can, facing things head on, can make them a lot easier to deal with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And again, you wouldn't really have this moment any other time.
Yeah.
Right? You definitely shouldn't have it a year out at the time of renewal and like all these things
100%.
bubbling up, right? So if you can find these moments, and sometimes these moments have to come from something known as a QBR or whatever you want to call it, but like a very structured.
Well, to that point, I think a huge benefit of a QBR is that folks know to expect these sort of conversations. And so just like you want to set expectations in the sales process that we need to align on as a team, what value we're going to provide for you, I would set expectations during the kickoff. I could have a whole other meeting about kickoffs. Like, kickoffs are such an important moment in how you set the tone of a relationship, and you invest a bunch in the kickoff, and that pays dividends later. In the kickoff, you need to clarify and be clear, we are going to have these. This is not an optional. It's like, part of what we do here is we meet with you for 1 hour or 1 day every quarter. We go through XYZ, and then we are going to talk about this topic. It is really fascinating how humans, when they know what to expect, react really differently. If in a random weekly meeting, you're like, and by the way, you guys haven't responded to XYZ in forever, and that's why we're having all these problems.
Totally.
It's like, whoa, I just joined this 30-minute call. I'm going to look at the tracker. But if they know to expect this is going to be a conversation about the partnership, you can have such great conversations that you would never have otherwise, because that's what we're here to do.
Yeah.
Let's make sure we're using all of our time wisely.
It's all about expectations, right?
Yes. And it gives folks an opportunity to air their own grievances. Again, you don't want to be surprised, but I will fully admit I have been surprised before of all of a sudden someone who you're having a hard time getting engagement with in that setting just kind of unloads on what the problem is. I would much rather know what the problem is than be ignorant and think everything's going well.
Absolutely. And I love this other one too, which is sometimes remembering that our clients, our customers are also curious, like what we're doing with other customers, right? And using that time to say, hey, by the way, these are some of the things we're doing with some of our other customers, right? Maybe it's something on the product roadmap, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that too.
Definitely. I think that fits in well either in the product roadmap session or the strategic partnership section. As you I would do this once you have like a handful of clients, so you have some credibility and test and learn what ideas are actually working. That's another area where I tell my team, if you're uncomfortable feeling like a salesperson, that's totally fine. Like, be a thought partner and say, hey, people are using our platform in this way and they're getting a ton of value. So one thing that we do is after every QBR season has ended, we get together as a company and throw out a bunch of ideas of things that seem to resonate. We're very careful to do this in a compliant way where we're not revealing the client we're talking about or any specific. We're not talking about their business strategy, to be very clear. We're saying, hey, they use our software in this way. We gather all of those data points, and then we'll use them in the next round of QBRs of, hey, here are some things that folks are doing with our platform that they've gotten a lot of value out of. We've universally gotten great feedback from that. Again, this is something that's free. It doesn't take a data scientist to invest in pulling these numbers. This is a 45-minute meeting at the end of every QBR session. If you have a huge team, have them submit it in a form. Like, this is something you should 100% do. And then we also turn that into product marketing insights. And we use them at our user sessions and our big summit every year. So you can take those nuggets and really repurpose them in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's just a reminder, like, when we think about enterprise customers, like, the reality is, like, I think so many of them are also looking to, like, their peers or understanding, like, what are other people in the industry doing, and if you can be a conduit to that, right? To these are the best practices, these are benchmarks, right? These are other things that you could also consider. It's, again, part of the consultative.
Well, that's why, again, if you're buying an enterprise platform, the buyers are expecting they're not just expecting the platform, they're expecting you to solve a problem.
Yes.
Especially at the C-suite level, I don't think they really care how you're solving that problem.
Yeah.
So hopefully your software is doing the majority of solving that problem, but giving them insights into how to run their business effectively using your system, that feels like they're really starting to get their money's worth versus, hey,
here's a button.
Here's a button.
Here's 4 more buttons. Yeah.
Button is my trigger word. So you're going to ask. If anyone asks you, we have a button that does this, that is a signal. What are you trying to solve for?
Yeah.
What are you trying to accomplish? And you're going to learn more about the client and their goals, get good, valuable feedback for product. But yeah, the word button should trigger everybody in enterprise.
I love that.
Software.
More and more awesome hot takes. Here's the last one I love that I've heard you say, which is, like, you have to be your own PR person.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's so, so critical, right? Because perhaps sometimes startups feel like, being your own PR person sometimes is hard, right?
This is where I really feel that being direct could solve so many problems in life. I do have a session I teach internally or give internally at our company called You're Your Own Olivia Pope. And it's like, hey, no, there is no fabulously dressed woman coming to save you. Like, you are the only person who can direct your life. So there's a session that's more about your own career, which is slightly off topic here, but I think is super important, particularly for maybe women or people who are more introverted, who don't feel comfortable speaking up on their successes. Yeah. No one else is coming to be your PR person. Like, you have to be your PR person. And then for the company, part of your remit in post-sale is that you're a PR person for this company. And I say that all the time. I say, no one's walking the halls of, company A being like, have you heard about this software? It's amazing. No one cares. Again, no one's doing that. You have to do it. Right. And if you can just reframe to yourself, oh, that's true. They're doing a bunch of stuff all day long. They may love our software, but it's just not top of mind. I think that's another helpful reframe to be like, okay, part of my job is a PR person for this.
We're all in PR.
And it's not a dirty word. It's like, hey,
absolutely.
Let me consistently be reiterating value, consistently repeating value so that it's just an instinct to someone to say, oh yeah, Workbench platform is the best out there. Yeah. And XYZ. What another favorite moment I have in clients is when you start hearing them regurgitating your own words.
Oh, beautiful.
And I do drive my team crazy on a lot of dimensions. One is repeating the same thing over and over again. And I'll say, look,
you have to.
This person at this QBR just repeated this exact phrase as a creation of their own mind. And that's because we have said it over and over again. And now it feels like it's their own idea.
That's so cool.
So we
That's
should
so
feel
cool.
excited, like so excited when that happens, and they start talking about the industry in the perspective.
Yeah. The other thing I like actually is when I hear our own customers or, talk about us in a way that is even better than I explain sometimes.
It will be because they actually use
Exactly.
it,
And I'm like, I like how you just described us. And we should probably write that down, right? I mean, that's really powerful too, right? When they like almost get you and the essence of who you are, right? Even better. Well, this is amazing. I mean, if you were to fast forward through this episode, what do you think is like the one punchy takeaway that everyone should remember and tweet and, go back and share with their team? I personally love the PR one. I think that summarizes so much.
I'd say
I want to hear
you're
from you.
your own PR person. I didn't explicitly say it this way, so take it or leave it, but I would tell all post-sale people to think of yourself in a lot of ways as the fulcrum of your organization. You are taking, the raw materials handed from sales. You are turning that into something. You are helping your clients' lives get better. You are informing the product. You are informing the messaging that you're putting out there. You have such a valuable wealth of information, and you are the expert on the value that you're creating in this space. So that's what my punchy line would be post-sale.
Yes.
You are the star.
You are the star.
And you have the keys to unlock value in every single part of your company. Yeah. No matter if you're in an SMB space, seeing 1,000 users a week, or whether you're in an enterprise space and you're dedicated to one Fortune 500 company, you have insights and nuggets that no one else at your company has. Take advantage of that to be both your own PR person for your career, and then take advantage to help your clients really get the most value out of your platform.
Yeah. My only yes and to that too is for founders who might not be so lucky to have a Rose as the head of post sales yet, if they're early on and early stage, is that they should be that person too.
100%.
Right. And again, like this might be oversimplifying, but most things at a startup can somewhat be solved by being closer to your customer.
I believe that 100%.
I believe that so deeply, and sitting with your customer, listening to, really listening to them, not pitching them, listening to them.
Yes.
Right? And having these conversations. So that's why, as much as we are, of course, there's so much we can say about all amazing post-sales people and the community there. It's a reminder that founders really, they're the first post-sales people, right?
I was going to say that just like the founder should think of themselves as the number one salesperson at their company, you should be the number one customer champion, evangelist, whatever.
Yes. Okay. Who do you think we should interview next?
Someone whose content I find really interesting and inspiring is James Kakis of Testbox on LinkedIn.
Oh, cool.
He really is, I think, leading the conversation in a lot of ways around where should post-sale live. And he has a whole thesis that I happen to share, that you shouldn't have pre- and post-sale teams. You should have one solution engineering team, which is how I have structured my teams.
Cool.
And that then you're not having as much of that handoff. And I think it is a separate topic, but encapsulates a lot of the themes we talked about here of from day one being laser focused on value.
I love that. And how can people follow you online?
People can follow me on LinkedIn at Rose Kozar. I'm not a huge online presence gal, but
yet. I mean, this pod episode is going to take you to the moon. So, thank you so much, Rose, for being here at the drafting table with us.
Thank you for letting me talk about my favorite subject in the world, post-sale.
We finally gave you the mic.
Maybe I'll get a hobby one day.
I love it.